They told me to move the boat or pay $500 a day, 3 words, typed on HOA letterhead, like a countdown clock stitched to a mailbox, and I read it twice just to make sure my eyes weren't playing a cheap trick on me. My name is Tom Hale. I'm the kind of man who fixes things with duct tape and stubbornness. And the boat is called Old June, named after my grandmother, because she taught me how to whistle while I painted the hull, and because sometimes the thing you love most in the world is just a silly, wooden excuse to keep a little bit of you afloat. I never thought that would make me an enemy. We live on the east side of Willowmere, a crooked little lake that used to be quiet enough that you could hear a loon complain about its own echo. Maya and I bought the cottage when the kids were small and the mortgage was smaller, and Old June lived on a weathered trailer under a tarp until I had time to restore her 3 nights here, a weekend there, and suddenly she was a thing that pulled neighbors out of their chairs. People waved, kids learned to drop anchors, and old men who thought the world had given up on charm came down to reminisce about boats that smelled of tar and gasoline. It was home. Then Eleanor Briggs got herself elected HOA president, and something about being handed a clipboard turned her into a person who mistook rules for religion. She had a training in logistics and a fondness for precise paperwork, and she loved nothing more than the sound of a rule being quoted back to her. Pride like that can harden into grief for other folks. At first it was little things, a notice about a misplaced lawn ornament, a reminder about paint shades. Then came the letter about Old Junean official violation, a demand to move the vessel from the yard, a $150 fine accruing daily. I wrote back a polite note, scanned the deed, sent a photo of the restored boat, told them it wasn't blocking anything. They answered with silence, then with fines. People assumed you'd fold when the bill looked big enough. I get that money scares the sensible into compliance. But Old June wasn't a car you could park down the street. She belonged to my wife the way a year belongs to a season. She had a name and a story and a dent from when our son slammed a skate into her bow and swore he'd fix it someday. Fines stacked up like sleeping bricks until they threatened to become a lien on the house. That's when I stopped playing nice. It's funny how people think bureaucracy is a brick wall. Turns out it's more like a maze where if you know which doors to try, there are exits and even a few shortcuts. I started reading. I called the county clerk. I dug through old plats. I sat with a box of microfilm like a man at a confessional, and the story came into focus. The lakeside parcels were a patchwork of old deeds, an estate that had dissolved without clear succession, paperwork that had been lost in a moving van decades ago. In short, there was a seam somewhere, and seams can be mended if you have the patience and a lawyer willing to take coffee-stained notes. Maya begged me to sell the boat. Tom, please, just sell it. We can split it, move on. And for a minute, I saw the math in her eyes. Our daughter's promotion was on the line. The hospital bills were a small, steady leak, and I could feel the weight of the world hovering like a gull over our porch. But sometimes things have gravity that has nothing to do with finance. Old June was a promise to my wife that we'd always make time for joy, and promises are stubborn. So I dug in, not with fists but with forms and filings, and with the feeling that if you fought with the right kind of stubbornness, legal, patient, public, you might be able to tilt the field. Eleanor escalated when she realized that I wasn't folding. She called a meeting at the clubhouse like a general summoning troops, and she made an example of me. We have to maintain property values, she declaimed, as if community had a single, non-negotiable noun. The board voted to levy more fines. They hired a tow company to move Old June. They posted signs in the neighborhood like little flags of shame. I could feel the neighborhood turning, some faces polite in the grocery store line, others avoiding our porch like it was a place where bad weather collects. That's when I did the quiet, dull work that nobody writes songs about. I filed a claim on an unclaimed parcel, formed a small trust, SB Legacy Trust, because lawyers like initials, and I paid what was owed to put the claim under my name. I filed the survey, I recorded a deed, and I did it in enough public that it couldn't be hidden under a stack of HOA memos. Bureaucracy, again, slow, tedious, but its lethargy is its vulnerability. You feed it evidence and witnesses and signatures, and at some point the paper either swallows you or it recognizes you. Eleanor's tactics grew desperate. She pointed fingers. She spread rumors that I was an eyesore, that I was jeopardizing insurance rates, that I was flouting community standards because I liked being difficult. The meeting in the clubhouse became a theater, and I felt like an actor who'd been summoned on short notice. You expect us to believe you own the lake now, she sneered in front of 20 people. And for a second, I wanted to slug Harold reflexes. Trained wrong, but that's not how you win a room full of witnesses. So I placed the deed on the table, pushed the recorded document across with a calm that felt like a practiced smile, and let the paper speak. There was a silence like a film cut. Faces shifted. The people who had nodded along at Eleanor's pronouncements realized they had been acting on rumors, not facts. Someone asked about past dues. Someone remembered a rusted sign at the north end that no one had bothered to read for 15 years. The chair rattled like an answer being dislodged from a shelf. Eleanor flailed forgery. She hissed. Accusations arrive quickly when pride is threatened, but the county clerk had already verified my filing. The tow truck company folded their contract. The fines, which had been sprouting like weeds, began to wilt under scrutiny. If that had been the end, it would have been a small Victoria man keeping his boat and life returning to a looser, ordinary rhythm. But people who taste authority and lose it often turn vicious. Eleanor hired landscapers who spilled diesel near our shoreline one night, by accident. They cut ropes that tied old June's trailer. They left messages that crossed a line from aggressiveness into menace. There was a night when someone smashed the lantern that hung on our porch, a scarlet smear of oil like an ugly signature. I called the sheriff. The sheriff made notes. The EPA got involved about the spill. Sometimes the law moves like a glacier, slow but inevitable, and sometimes it slices clean. The confrontation that mattered happened in public. Eleanor stood in the clubhouse like a captain who had lost her compass, and I walked in with the sheriff's report, the environmental complaint, the deed, and a recorded conversation where she'd admitted in her own phone to her treasurer that the bylaw she'd been invoking was, in her words, more of a guideline we made up when we needed a win. There is a particular sound when a manufactured authority crumples like a menu dropped in a Winstermand. It was louder than any shouted exchange. People looked at each other. Some were embarrassed, some were angry. A few offered apologies that tasted like beginnings. Eleanor was charged trespass, environmental damage, falsifying record charges that have a way of making names sound smaller. The HOA board was forced into an emergency vote. Reforms were proposed, bylaws reviewed, and a lot of little resentments that had been simmering in Willowmere got an airing. It wasn't a fairy tale reversal. People are complicated, and power does not evaporate simply because it is called out, but it shifted the air. Old June stayed where she belonged. The lien threats were rescinded. A bench was installed near the dock with a small brass plate that read, "For those who make time." I sat on it once, looked at the wobble of light on water, and felt relief like rain after a furnace storm. But peace, when it arrives via paperwork and police reports, leaves a scratch at the edge of everything. Some neighbors still move their eyes quickly when our porch comes into view. A few smiles feel like apologies that never learned how to be sincere. Maya jokes that we should sell old June every time a power bill arrives, jokes that keep the fear from settling into the furniture, and I laugh, because humor is a way to stitch the heart back together. I think about Eleanor sometimes, not with gloating, but with a strange sort of pity. People who build empires on the backs of rules often forget the small human truths rules are meant to protect. Here's the part one want you to keep in mind. Community is not a rulebook glued to a clipboard. It's a weather system, delicate, changeable, and worth tending. Power concentrates, and when it does, it needs sunlight and skepticism. I could have packed old June away. I could have paid the fines and watched the weeknights pass in quieter compliance. But something about that felt like handing my story to someone who'd rewrite it. I didn't want that. I wanted to keep my name attached to the life I built, even the messy parts. So now, if you live in a place where someone with a clipboard tells you something that doesn't smell right, read the letter, make a call, ask a question. If they tell you a bylaw exists, ask to see it in print. Authority likes the shadows, and facts love light. If you've ever had to choose between giving up a small joy to keep a larger peace, tell me what you picked and why, because I promise you this. There's more to being right than simply winning. Tell me whether you think I went too far, whether Eleanor deserved what came to her, and whether communities should have more ways to check themselves before people get hurt. Drop a comment, share with someone who needs to see this. And if you liked how this one closed bitter and a little hopeful, hit like and subscribe, because I've got another story about a fence line and a neighbor who swore the moon belonged to him.